Hey everybody, I am responding in this vlog to somebody who sent me to a article about Android and whether or not Google will have to trash Android because of the problems that Android has. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I think the major issue is the lack of consistency between the Android handsets, the hardware. So as such, when you see a new version of Android is released, it takes a long time before the Android universe, all the different Android phones, update to the latest version of Android. And I guess there's a bunch of problems with that, I suppose, with security and feature sets and so on. And yes, it's very different from iOS, where it's all basically controlled by Apple. So you have, just a couple of phones you have to deal with. So that makes it much easier to manage the operating system. In this case, it's iOS versus Android. And of course, it's also much easier as an app developer to develop for iOS, since you don't have to develop for 50,000 phones out there. Well, the solution is, as was pointed out in the article, I think, is for vendors of Android apps to only target a particular version of Android, maybe particular devices. Fortunately for vendors, you see I think it's probably Nexus and Samsung are taking the lion's share of things. So anyway, back to the original question, will Android get killed? Well, will Google have to destroy Android because of some inherent weaknesses in the operating system? The guy in this article cited the fact that it was based on Linux, and there was legal issues, and there was kernel issues. The kernel is like the core of the operating system. So what's my take on this whole thing? I don't want to go down all the details, but let me give you some general comments. Now, this is based on somebody here. I've never done any Android development, although I've done a lot of Java development in the day, and Android is done with Java. Not that that's too relevant, but anyway, whatever. Generally speaking, it's a bad idea to rewrite software from scratch. Mature software, older software tends to have less bugs and is more stable because of refinements and refinements and refinements. Now, with Android, not knowing all the details, my guess is that you're just going to have to, as Google, say, listen, when you're building your phones, let's start limiting some of our hardware choices to X, Y, and Z. Let's conform a little bit to certain parameters, maybe not as closely as iPhone, but perhaps to a certain degree, so that the operating system can better manage the situation. That being said, I don't know if there's a huge problem with Android because, yeah, I'm sure I heard the code base is pretty messy inside. I don't know what iOS is all about, and I know it's difficult to code for Android because there's all these different devices. And that is not necessarily a function of the core of the operating system. That could be resolved using something called a facade. It's a design pattern in software development, and a facade is basically a layer of code that sits on top of another layer of code. So perhaps in later versions of Android, Google could just create facades targeting maybe 3 or 4 tranches of devices, 3 or 4 categories of devices, and then the hardware manufacturers could build accordingly. That might be a solution there. Again, getting back to the original point I was going to make, I've been using stock Android for a few years now. I love it. Very stable, works fantastic. I heard that the Samsung variation of their Android with their, I think what their TouchWiz, I think it is, their layer that they build on top of Android is very fast. I was just looking at the S7 from Samsung. Works great. Seems to work good to me. It's very fast, responsive. And, so I'm not sure in terms of using the devices, I see a huge difference between iOS and Android in terms of functionality and stability and so forth. I don't know, but I've had my Android for years. It's fantastic. So I guess that comes back to who's getting the later version. Is it such a huge issue that certain phones don't update to the latest version of Android? I don't know if that's a huge issue, to be honest with you. Look at all the people who are still running Windows 7. Heck, there's a lot of people who are running 10, 12, whatever, how many years old XP is now. Not that I would advise to do that, but that's my take on it. My general takeaway is that this author is, I'm not convinced of his arguments, because in my experience, to rewrite an app from scratch is just begging for a huge amount of work. Usually when you rewrite an app from scratch, you're exchanging an old set of bugs for a new set of bugs. And it's a very rare thing that you see a company decide to scrap a code base and move on. And you only do that when the real core is so bad that it can't really adapt. The biggest example I can think of is Mac OS. When Mac OS went from version 9 to 10, it was a total rewrite, and it had to be done because the core of Mac OS was so ancient and so hobbled that there was no way around it, right? There was no way around it in terms of multitasking and memory management and so forth. So they had to move on from that. But if you look at Windows, which is a more modern Windows 95, Windows NT is the basis of Windows 10 as far as I understand. And that's a very old operating system. And because it was built with a modern architecture, I don't see a need to update the core Windows for a long time. They just have to fix things. And I think that that's what you're going to see with Android. I don't think it's too bad, so bad rather, that they'll need to totally trash it. I just don't see that happening. And one of the reasons I don't see that happening, again, I have Android phones. A lot of people have Android phones. They work great. Even if you don't get the latest version of Android for 8 months, a year, or whatever, who cares? It works great. And as far as app developer is concerned, I would just be targeting later phones for the most part, depending on the type of app that you're running. But if you're running a specific business app, businesses are not going to have their people on 5-year-old phones. If they do, or 3-year-old phones, or 4-year-old phones. If they do, they're probably not going to buy your app because they don't want to spend any money to begin with. So I would just be coding against the flagship devices, the top Samsung, the top Google devices, and I would just code accordingly. Another thing you could do is write your Android apps in HTML5. Use HTML5 stack and use a translation matrix like Cordova or PhoneGap. That might be a way to handle it. Let them deal with the issues. Again, I'm jumping around here. So yeah, I don't see Android being rewritten from scratch. I don't think that's going to happen. That's it. We'll talk soon.